The sky had been blue all morning, but Dan Blocker stopped mid-sentence and looked west at something the cameras could not see. A wall of black clouds rolling toward the ranch location faster than any horse could run. Notice what he does in the next 90 seconds, because the director is still calling for one more take. The crew is still adjusting lights, and nobody else seems to understand that the weather is about to turn this western set into a disaster zone. The day had started with the kind of perfect conditions that made location scouts look like geniuses. The ranch sat in a valley about 40 miles from the studio, a working cattle operation that rented out its picturesque acres to television productions whenever Hollywood needed something more authentic than a backlot could provide. The main house had that weathered dignity that art directors spent thousands of dollars trying to fake, its wooden walls silvered by decades of sun and wind, its porch sagging just enough to suggest generations of use. The corrals were solid and functional, built by hands that understood the difference between looking right and being right. The hills rising in the distance gave every shot a sense of scope that you simply could not manufacture on a soundstage, their slopes covered with dry grass that rippled in the breeze like a golden ocean. Dan had been in good spirits when the convoy of trucks and trailers arrived at dawn. There was something about shooting on location that he genuinely loved, something that connected him to the reality beneath the make-believe. The air smelled different out here, like grass and dust and horse sweat, and the particular sweetness of sage that grew wild along the fence lines, not like sawdust and fresh paint, and the particular staleness of a studio that had been sealed against the outside world. The sounds were different too, birds calling from the cottonwood trees near the creek, wind whispering through the grass, the occasional distant lowing of cattle, reminding everyone that this was a real place where real work happened even when the cameras were not rolling. The scene they were shooting was a conversation between Dan's character and a rancher played by a veteran character actor named Howard. It was the kind of dialogue-heavy scene that directors loved to capture on location because the authenticity of the background sold the reality of the words. Two men standing by a corral fence, talking about land and legacy, and the hard choices that came with both. Simple to block, simple to light, simple to execute, assuming nothing went wrong. Write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from, and what time is it right now? Because what happened over the next hour is the kind of story that the publicity department never released, and the network executives never heard about, but it tells you everything you need to know about the difference between a man who reads lines for a living and a man who reads the world around him. The production had 3 hours and 45 minutes of shooting left before they would lose the afternoon light. The schedule was tight but manageable, assuming they could get through the remaining setups without any major delays. The director, a meticulous man named Patterson, who had been doing this work for 20 years, had already blocked the first 2 scenes of the day and was feeling cautiously optimistic about finishing on time. Dan delivered his lines with the easy naturalness that had made him valuable to the production. Howard matched him beat for beat, the 2 actors finding a rhythm together that made the scripted words sound like genuine conversation. The crew worked around them with professional efficiency, adjusting reflectors to soften the harsh midday sun, repositioning the camera for different angles, doing the 100 small tasks that transformed raw footage into something worth watching. By early afternoon, they had captured most of what they needed. Patterson was talking about breaking for lunch early, rewarding the crew for their efficient work with an extra 30 minutes of rest before the final push of the day. The mood on location was relaxed, almost festive. Someone had brought a radio, and country music drifted across the ranch yard, mixing with the sounds of horses shifting in the corral and crew members chatting between setups. And then Dan stopped talking and looked west. Look at what happened in this moment. His body went still in that particular way that animals go still when they sense danger. His head turned slowly, deliberately, tracking something on the horizon that nobody else had noticed. The smile that had been playing at the corners of his mouth disappeared, replaced by an expression that the people who knew him well had learned to take seriously. "Dan?" Howard had been waiting for his next line, confused by the sudden pause. "You okay?" Dan did not answer. He was staring at the western horizon, at a line of darkness that was building along the ridge of hills that bordered the valley. To most of the crew, it probably looked like nothing more than a shadow, maybe the edge of some high clouds passing over. But Dan had grown up in country like this. He had spent his childhood watching his father read the sky the way other men read newspapers. And what he was seeing now was not a shadow. It was trouble. "Patterson." Dan's voice cut through the ambient noise of the location, sharp enough to make people stop what they were doing. "We need to talk, right now." The director looked up from the shot list he had been reviewing with his assistant. His expression shifted from mild annoyance to concern as he registered the seriousness in Dan's tone. In the years they had worked together, he had learned that Dan Blocker did not interrupt production without good reason. 3 hours and 20 minutes of shooting light remained. The schedule was still achievable. The momentum of a good day was still carrying them forward. But something in Dan's voice made Patterson set down his clipboard and walk over to where the big man was standing, still staring at the western sky. "What is it?" "Storm coming." Dan pointed toward the horizon, toward that line of darkness that was slowly, inexorably growing. "A bad one. We need to wrap up and get everyone out of here." Patterson squinted at the sky. To his city-trained eyes, the threat was not immediately obvious. The sun was still shining on the ranch. The air was still warm and relatively calm. Yes, there were some clouds building in the distance, but clouds built and dissipated all the time out here. That was just what weather did in open country. "Dan, I appreciate the concern, but we're so close to finishing. Another hour, maybe 90 minutes, and we'll have everything we need. We can't just abandon a whole day's work because of some clouds." "Wait, before we go any further, you need to understand the weight of what Patterson was asking. He was not being unreasonable by the standards of the industry. Productions ran on schedules and budgets, and both of those things suffered when shooting days were cut short. Every hour of location work cost money. Every scene that had to be reshot cost more. The pressure to stay on schedule was constant, relentless, and it came from people who sat in air-conditioned offices and never felt the wind shift or smelled the particular metallic quality that the air took on before a serious storm. But Dan had felt that wind shift, and he had smelled that metallic quality, and everything his father had taught him about reading the sky was screaming that they needed to move. "Patterson, I grew up on a ranch. My father could tell you what the weather was going to do 6 hours before it did it, and he taught me everything he knew." That Dan pointed again at the darkening horizon is not some clouds. That is a front, a fast-moving front with a lot of energy behind it. When it hits this valley, it's going to hit hard. We've got maybe 45 minutes, an hour at most. The director looked at the sky again, trying to see what Dan was seeing. The darkness had grown since they started talking. That much was undeniable. And now that he was paying attention, he could feel something different in the air. A heaviness, a tension, like the world was holding its breath. 3 hours of shooting light remained, but suddenly, the light did not seem as reliable as it had a few minutes ago. "What exactly are you saying we should do?" "Get everyone to shelter, the main house, the equipment trucks, anywhere with solid walls and a roof. Get the horses into the barn. Secure anything that could blow away or become a projectile. And we need to start right now, not in 10 minutes, not after one more take, right now." Listen to the resistance that rose up in Patterson's mind. Everything he had been trained to do, everything the industry had taught him about being a director, screamed against abandoning a shooting day based on one actor's weather prediction. There would be questions from the studio. There would be budget implications. There would be the embarrassment of calling a wrap and then having the storm miss them entirely, leaving him looking like an overcautious fool. But there was something in Dan's eyes that made Patterson hesitate, a certainty that went beyond mere opinion. This was not a guess. This was knowledge, the kind of knowledge that came from growing up close to the land, from learning to read signs that city people had forgotten existed. If you're wrong about this, if I'm wrong, you can take it out of my next paycheck. But if I'm right, and we don't move, people are going to get hurt, equipment is going to get destroyed. Those horses in the corral are going to panic and injure themselves, or someone else. I've seen what these storms can do, Patterson. I've seen them pick up fence posts and throw them through walls. I've seen them turn cattle troughs into missiles. This is not something you gamble with. 2 hours and 45 minutes of shooting light remained. But the darkness in the west was growing faster now, visibly expanding, eating the blue sky that had seemed so permanent just an hour ago. And the wind, which had been a gentle breeze all morning, was starting to gust with an unpredictable intensity that made the reflectors wobble on their stands. Notice the moment when Patterson made his decision. It was not dramatic. There was no thunderclap of revelation, no sudden conversion from skeptic to believer. There was simply a man looking at another man he trusted, looking at a sky that was changing faster than he had ever seen a sky change, and doing the math that every good leader eventually has to do, the cost of being wrong in one direction versus the cost of being wrong in the other. All right, Patterson turned to his assistant director, who had been hovering nearby, trying to follow the conversation. Call it. We're wrapping for the day. I want everyone either in the main house or in the equipment trucks within 15 minutes. No exceptions, no delays. Move. The assistant director's eyes went wide. But we've still got 3 hours of... You heard me. Move. Now. Remember what it takes to shut down a location shoot. It is not like turning off a light switch. There are cameras to pack. There are lights to secure. There are props and costumes, and 1,000 small items that need to be accounted for and stored somewhere safe. Under normal circumstances, wrapping a location takes an hour or more of careful, methodical work. They did not have an hour. Dan was already moving before Patterson finished giving the order. He strode across the ranch yard toward the corral where 6 horses stood, their ears rotating nervously as they picked up on the changing atmosphere. The wranglers were still gathered near the catering truck, unaware of the urgency that had just descended on the production. We need to get these horses into the barn, Dan called out, his voice carrying across the yard with an authority that made people move without questioning. Right now, all of them. And someone check if there are any other animals on the property that need to be secured. 2 hours and 30 minutes of shooting light remained, but the light itself was changing now, taking on a strange yellowish quality as the approaching storm began to filter the sun. The shadows were lengthening in the wrong direction, stretching east instead of north, and the temperature was dropping with an almost physical pressure that made everyone's skin prickle. Wait, stop for a moment, and picture this scene from above, the ranch yard, transforming from a relaxed production location into a hive of urgent activity. Crew members running in every direction, carrying equipment, securing loose items, helping each other move faster than they had ever moved on a set before. The horses being led from the corral to the barn, their eyes rolling white with an animal awareness of the danger that was bearing down on them. And in the center of it all, Dan Blocker, moving from group to group, directing, encouraging, lending his considerable strength wherever it was needed most. The first lightning bolt hit the hills to the west about 20 minutes after Patterson called the wrap. It was close enough to feel a crack of electricity that made the hair on everyone's arms stand up and sent a shock wave of thunder rolling across the valley. The horses screamed in the barn. Someone dropped a light stand with a crash that was swallowed by the greater noise of the approaching storm. Inside, Dan bellowed. Everyone inside now. Leave whatever you're carrying and get to shelter. The crew abandoned their careful packing and ran. Props were left where they fell. Camera cases sat open in the yard. A rack of costumes blew over and scattered period dresses across the dirt like fallen leaves. None of it mattered anymore. The only thing that mattered was getting bodies behind walls before the sky opened up. 1 hour and 55 minutes of theoretical shooting light remained, but there was no light anymore. Not really. The storm had swallowed the sun, turning afternoon into a premature twilight that pulsed with an eerie greenish glow. The wind had become a constant roar, no longer gusting but sustaining, bending the trees at the edge of the property and sending anything loose tumbling across the yard. Dan was the last one through the door of the main ranch house. He had stayed outside until he was certain everyone was accounted for, doing a mental head count against the crew list he had memorized during the first week of production. 43 people on location today. 43 people now crammed into a ranch house that had never been designed to hold more than a dozen. Listen closely to what happened in the next 15 minutes. The storm did not merely arrive. It attacked. Rain came down not in drops but in sheets, horizontal sheets driven by wind that howled around the corners of the house and found every gap, every crack, every weakness in the old building's defenses. Hail followed the rain, stones the size of marbles, hammering the roof with a sound like 1,000 drummers gone mad. Lightning struck somewhere close enough to make the lights flicker and die, leaving everyone in a darkness broken only by the strobing flashes through the windows. And then the wind truly arrived. It was not like anything most of the crew had ever experienced. City people, studio people, they knew wind as an inconvenience, something that messed up hair and knocked over coffee cups. This was different. This was wind as a force of nature. Wind that picked up the costume rack that had blown over in the yard and threw it into the side of one of the equipment trucks, hard enough to dent the metal. Wind that found a loose shutter on the barn and ripped it off its hinges, sending it spinning across the ranch yard like a blade. Wind that made the old ranch house groan and creak as if it were alive, as if it were straining against invisible hands trying to tear it apart. 1 hour and 15 minutes of theoretical shooting light remained. But nobody was thinking about shooting anymore. They were thinking about survival. They were pressed together in the center of the main room, away from the windows that were rattling in their frames with every gust, holding on to each other like passengers on a ship in a storm. Some were crying openly, tears running down faces that had been confident and professional just an hour before. Some were praying, their lips moving in silent appeals to whatever higher power might be listening. All of them were afraid, their fear a tangible presence in the crowded room. All of them except Dan Blocker. He moved through the crowded room like a calm center in a hurricane, which was almost literally what he was. His voice was steady, reassuring, a counterpoint to the chaos raging outside. He checked on the actors and the crew members and the ranch hands who had been caught on the property when the storm hit. He made sure no one was injured, no one was panicking too badly, no one was about to do something stupid like try to run outside. "It's going to pass," he kept saying, his voice somehow carrying over the roar of the wind. "Storms like this are violent, but they're fast. It's going to pass. And we're all going to be fine. Just stay together. Stay calm. It's going to pass." Remember Patterson, the director who had almost insisted on continuing to shoot. He was pressed against a wall near the fireplace, his face pale, his hands shaking. He had seen the costume rack hit the equipment truck. He had heard the shutter tear off the barn. He knew with the terrible clarity of hindsight exactly what would have happened if they had still been out there when the storm hit. People would have been hurt. People might have been killed, and it would have been his fault, his decision, his stubbornness that put them in harm's way. Dan found him in the chaos, put a hand on his shoulder, leaned close so he could speak without shouting. "It's okay," Dan said. "You made the right call. We're all safe because you listened. That's what matters. That's the only thing that matters." Patterson could not speak. He just nodded, tears mixing with the rain that had somehow found its way inside, despite the closed windows and doors. The storm passed in about 40 minutes. It felt like hours when the wind finally began to die, and the rain started to slacken, when the lightning moved east, and the thunder became a distant rumbling instead of an immediate threat. The crew emerged from the ranch house like survivors of a shipwreck, blinking in the strange clear light that followed the storm. 45 minutes of shooting light remained. Not that anyone was thinking about shooting. Notice what they saw when they looked around the ranch yard. The equipment trucks had survived, their solid construction and low profiles making them resistant to the wind that had torn across the valley with such fury. But the production equipment that had been left outside was scattered across an acre of mud and debris. Camera cases had been thrown against fences, their latches sprung open and their contents spilled into the dirt. Light stands were tangled in bushes 100 yards from where they had been abandoned, their aluminum frames bent at impossible angles. The costume rack was embedded in the side of a truck, its metal frame bent at an angle that testified to the force of the impact, period dresses still clinging to the hangers like flags of surrender. And the corral fence, the solid wooden fence, where Dan and Howard had been standing just an hour ago, delivering lines about land and legacy and hard choices. That fence was gone, not damaged, not weakened, gone. The wind had picked it up in pieces and scattered it across the valley. The posts and rails that had seemed so solid, now lying in fragments as far as the eye could see. Heavy posts that had been sunk 3 feet into the ground had been ripped out and thrown like matchsticks. Rails that had held 1,000-pound bulls had been snapped like dry twigs. If they had still been shooting, if they had stayed for one more take, one more setup, one more hour of trying to stay on schedule, the crew would have been exposed. The actors would have been in the open. The horses would have been in that corral when the fence came apart. Dan stood in the center of the yard, looking at the destruction, and felt something settle in his chest. Not satisfaction, not pride, just a quiet gratitude that his father's lessons had proven reliable, that the instinct to read the sky had been passed down through generations for exactly this kind of moment. Patterson approached him slowly, picking his way through the debris. His face was still pale, but his hands had stopped shaking. He looked at the destroyed corral fence, at the scattered equipment, at the dent in the side of the truck where the costume rack had struck. "I owe you an apology," Patterson said. "When you first told me to rap, I thought you were overreacting. I thought you were being paranoid. I almost—" He could not finish the sentence. "You didn't," Dan said simply. "That's what matters. When it counted, you listened. A lot of people wouldn't have. How did you know? I've been doing this for 20 years, shooting on locations all over the country, and I've never seen anything like that. How did you know it was coming?" Listen closely to Dan's answer, because it explains something important about who he was and where he came from. "My father was a rancher. A real one, not a television one. He used to say that the sky was the only newspaper that never lied. You just had to learn how to read it. He taught me to watch for the signs, the way the clouds build, the way the wind shifts direction, the way the air feels different when something big is coming. It's not magic. It's just paying attention to things that most people have forgotten how to see." The cleanup took the rest of the day and most of the next morning. The production lost 2 days of shooting to the storm, days that would have to be made up later at additional cost to the studio. But no one was injured. No one was killed. The equipment that had been destroyed could be replaced easily. The footage that had been lost could be reshot. If you want to hear what happened on the night Dan Blocker received a phone call that would change everything he thought he knew about his own brother, tell me in the comments. Because this was not the only time his instincts and his connection to the land saved people from disaster. There were other moments, other times when the lessons his father taught him proved more valuable than anyone expected. And every single time, Dan Blocker was the one who read the signs, the one who spoke up when the sky was sending warnings, the one who refused to let schedules and budgets override what his gut and his heritage were telling him. That was Dan Blocker, a man who read the weather like his father had taught him to do, a man who trusted what the sky was saying when everyone around him was looking at clipboards and call sheets, a man who understood that real knowledge comes from paying attention to the world, not just to the scripts and schedules that human beings create. The ranch location is still there. Decades later, the corral fence was rebuilt stronger than before. The main house still stands, its walls still bearing the scars of that storm, in places where the repair work never quite matched the original construction. The current owners have heard the story of the television crew that almost got caught in the storm, the story of the big actor who saw it coming when no one else did. But somewhere, in the memories of everyone who was there that day, there is an afternoon that started with blue sky and ended with revelation, a morning that felt like routine until the western horizon turned black and everything changed. A moment when a man looked up from his work, read something in the clouds that no one else could see, and made the choice that kept 43 people safe when nature decided to remind everyone that some forces cannot be scheduled or controlled. That is the inheritance Dan Blocker left behind for us. Not the character he played, though millions remember that too, but the connection to the land, the respect for natural forces, the understanding that the sky speaks a language that human beings use to understand, and that some of us still remember how to hear. And maybe that is enough. And maybe that is everything that truly matters when the storms of life come rolling in, and the only thing standing between safety and disaster is someone who learned long ago to read the signs that others have forgotten how to see.